So, prevention strategies, that is interventions, how to prevent central line associated bloodstream infection. So, the intervention, promotion of the best practices, maximal barrier precautions, use of chlorhexidine for skin cleansing prior to insertion, avoidance of femoral site for insertion of the central line, use of recommended insertion site dressing practices, and the fifth one is removal of the central line when no longer it is needed. Educational module about bloodstream infection prevention, engagement of the leadership and clinicians, standard tools for recording adherence to the best practices, standardizing catheter insertion kits, and measurement of the CLABSI and reporting the rates back to the end users. So, these are very important preventable strategies. So, if you see in one study 9% of central line outside the ICU deemed inappropriate. So, if you go and check there you can find that there are many of the central lines which are unnecessary. Ensure utilization of the insertion bundles. So, chlorhexidine for skin preps or antisepsis, maximum sterile barrier precautions like mask, cap, gown should be worn, sterile gloves should be used, and large sterile drape and hand hygiene. So, one should wash their hands as if they are going to operate on a patient. So, it should be a surgical hand washing rather than just casual with chlorhexidine. And many central lines in patients on non-ICU hospital wards are placed outside those wards, like in emergency rooms or ICUs, operating rooms or pre-operative areas. So, there you have to have all these checklist put together. In one study 49% of central lines were present on admission to the ward. Rates of bloodstream infections in this study were higher in central lines placed in ER. So, emergency room placement of central lines is one of the risk factor for CLABSI. So, facilitating proper insertion practices, that is bundling all needed supplies is one area, that is a cart or a kit. So, when you actually are planning to insert a central line, everything should be together. Means you should not run for a needle, you should not run for a catheter, or you should not everything should be planned so that the rates of CLABSI will come down. Use of a checklist to ensure all insertion practices are followed may be beneficial. Empowering staff nurse to stop a non-emergent central line insertion if proper measures are not followed, and promoting safety cultures. So, hand hygiene should be a cornerstone of CLABSI prevention efforts, and most importantly is when you are actually checking the central line associated bloodstream infection data. First of all, understand some of the important points. This is very important. When a patient has got a central line and you need not to wait for 48 hours or 72 hours to call this as a central line associated bloodstream infection, unlike what we see in CAUTI and VAP. Because if you are inserting a central line, a patient immediately can get chills and fevers if it is infected. So, as early as you see that there is a new onset of fever, or patient has got rigors and chills, or drop in blood pressure, or high white cell counts, or insertion site or exit site of these catheters, there is visible pus or inflammation, immediately suspect a central line associated bloodstream infection. And most important thing is you need to take blood cultures from different hubs of the central line, as well as simultaneously from the peripheral line, and you can name that as from the peripheral and central. You can put those stickers on the blood culture bottles, and the important thing is you have to mention the date and the timing. Why this is important? Because while collecting the data, we should know that when you send suppose a blood sample from the central line and peripheral line together, and you need to ask your lab if both the blood culture bottles are growing the same organism, that is first point. And you should ask your lab whether the blood sample which was taken from the central line is growing the organism more rapidly than the one collected from the peripheral line. That is called as differential time to positivity. So, that differential time to positivity should be more than 2 hours minimum. meaning your central line blood is having a rapid or higher number of germs or bacteria than your peripheral line, and that establishes the diagnosis of central line bloodstream infection. Then regarding the further preventive strategies, chlorhexidine skin cleansing is important. Prior to use should ensure agent is compatible with the catheter, because each different manufacturers of the catheters, they recommend a particular concentration of chlorhexidine. And central line site of choice for adult patients receiving non-tunneled central lines, femoral site should be avoided due to an increased risk of infection and deep venous thrombosis. Then hub and access port cleansing. So, bloodstream infection outbreaks have been associated with failure to adequately decontaminate the catheter hubs or failure to change them at appropriate intervals. This is very important. Cleans hubs prior to use with an appropriate antiseptic, that is 70% alcohol, should be properly followed, and manufacturer recommendations regarding cleansing and changing the connectors should be followed. So, personnel responsible for the insertion and maintenance of the catheter should be trained and demonstrate the competence. In my hospital, we have actually started this program called a certification program. So, where we train the nurses, then again we recheck whether the training has been adequate and they are compatible, and this kind of checking is done periodically. And recurrent educational sessions for staff who care and or insert central lines should be done. Supplemental strategies like chlorhexidine bathing can be used. Antimicrobial impregnated catheters have been tried, but not shown any great reduction in CLABSI. Chlorhexidine impregnated dressings, of course, has been used, but again does not give you a clear picture to reduce CLABSI or not. One of the important aspect here which I forgot to mention is use of transparent dressing materials, because if you keep that pink colored Dynaplast and all there, you are actually not able to see the insertion site, whether there is a pus collection or not, and that is why I think using a transparent dressing is important. So, this is the summary. Removing unnecessary central lines, following proper incision practices, facilitating proper incision practices, complying with hand hygiene, performing adequate skin cleaning, choosing the proper site for central line insertion, performing adequate hub and access port cleaning when you are actually using it, providing education on central line insertion and maintenance. So, when you are measuring the CLABSI, have a definition that is consistent between the sites. So, yeah, this slide I would like to show you that how to collect the rates, that is CLABSI rate, CLABSI identified divided by central line days. So, actually for example, if you see in your 10-bedder ICU, 3 patients are on central line, 1 patient is on central line since 4 days, the second one is from the 3 days, and the third one is from the 3 days. So, basically 4 plus 3 plus 3, that is 10 catheter days, and out of them, if in that particular month one has got a CLABSI as per our definition as we discussed just now. So, 1 divided by 10 into 1000, that is going to give you the CLABSI rate. And device utilization ratio and all, these are like further intricacies when you are going to actually go for a outbreak investigation and management. So, another thing is this central line insertion practices adherence rate. This is also one of the new aspects which can be tried, and you can see on these slides here, and calculating clip adherence rate, and this kind of chart which can be used to collect the data for CLABSI. So, we will go to our next hospital acquired infection, and that is VAP or VAE. See, basically ventilator pneumonia has been used prior, but from 2013 onwards, the CDC and even the WHO and now NABH, they are recommending ventilator events to be measured, because why? So we'll just see in this. So these are some of the new surveillance definitions on board. The weakness of traditional VAP surveillance limit their utility for measuring the impact of care, improvement programs, and for benchmarking quality of care between the different healthcare facilities. Basically, one hospital collecting a VAP data and the second hospital collecting the VAP data. If you want to compare that, there was a huge amount of difference and shortcomings were noticed. So in 2011-12, CDC developed a new approach for surveillance for mechanically ventilated patients in an attempt to overcome some of these limitations of traditional VAP surveillance. So new surveillance definitions on board are: infection and pneumonia is not the only complication of intubation or related to intubation and mechanical ventilation, but improvement in quality of care necessitates the surveillance of these complications like ARDS, pulmonary edema, atelectasis and pneumothorax. So your patients are going to have some other non-infection related complications just because of the mere presence of the endotracheal tube and mechanical ventilation there. So surveillance needs objective tools measurable in a potentially easy, effective and reproducible way, and that is why these new definitions have come in picture. So now now we are going to call this as VAE or ventilator associated events or ventilator associated conditions. So objective definitions of predicted on sustained increase in the ventilator settings after a period of stability. You can read this, but I will just explain you in a simpler way. So suppose your patient has been put on a endotracheal tube and attached to a mechanical ventilator. So and you see that this person is requiring a constant FiO2 or a minimum concentration of oxygen which is required by that patient is, suppose for example 40%. On 1st September you have ventilated that patient, on till 3rd or 4th his continuous requirement of FiO2 is say 40%, but suddenly on 5th or 6th you see that his requirement of FiO2 is going up. So he is no more requiring just 40%, but the requirement is 60%, and or if your mechanical ventilator settings, that is requirement of the PEEP, is also going up. So in that situation you can think of a VAE or a ventilator associated event. So once you know that this is a ventilator associated event, and then the next step is whether this is an infection related VAE or a non-infectious related VAE. So so what are you going to do? You are going to actually take the samples from the endotracheal tube and send it for gram staining and culture. And if there is a gram stain positive, but your culture is negative, that could be a possible VAP. But when your gram stain is positive and your cultures are positive, then you are going to call this as a probable VAP. And probable VAP is the closest proxy for our previous traditional VAP definition. So you understood the VAC or ventilator associated event is defined by greater than or equal to 2 days of stable or decreasing daily PEEP or daily minimum FiO2, followed by an increase in daily minimum PEEP greater than 1 or equal to 3 centimeter or equal to 0.20 point sustained for greater than or equal to 2 calendar days. So the same thing, like basically your requirement of PEEP and FiO2 was stable or actually in fact decreasing, but suddenly you see that after 2 days or 3 days, minimum 2 days, your FiO2 requirement is increased by 0.2, that is 20%. So basically from 40 to it goes to 60%, or your PEEP requirement is from 5 it goes to minimum 8 or above that, then definitely you consider this as a VAE. So infection related ventilator associated condition is triggered by the presence of possible infection indicators concurrent with the VAC onset, namely an abnormal temperature. So of course those things you are going to see, that patient has got fever and there are white blood cell count is greater than 12,000 or lesser than 4,000, and one or more new antibiotic starts that continue for greater than or equal to 4 days. So, basically anything which is requiring antibiotic use for more than 4 days, or patient has got fever or hypothermia, in fact higher counts or lower counts. So, that is infection related VAP. So, new surveillance definition on board, these are for adult patients especially developed by CDC, and they may be applicable for pediatric patients, and we will come to know about this in nearer future, because these are latest and we have data which is not available for application over the pediatrics. So, if you see it has been compared with the previous surveillance definitions of VAP, and in multi-center database in France, 3028 patients with more than 5 days of mechanical ventilation, and 77% had at least one VAC, and 29% had at least one infection related VAC, and good correlation with pneumonia and antibiotic use was seen. So, is VAP preventable? Because of its importance and impact on the morbidity in ICU patients, VAP or VAC prevention was included in IHI campaign to save 1 lakh and 5 million lives. IHI is Institute for Health Improvements. Preventing measures in studies were able to reduce VAP rates. In USA, there is a striking decline in VAP by applying all these preventive measures has been seen. So, a particular hospital, if they can do it, why not the other hospital? And this is going to be more stringent nowadays in nearer future, when many of the hospitals are going to treat patients who are insured, because insurance companies are definitely going to reject the claims if it's a hospital acquired infection. So, this is going to be a tough task for every hospital, and they have to implement these strategies very carefully and very religiously, I mean to say. So, zero VAP for the moment is an artifact of the old surveillance definition, but definitely we can cut down on our VAE rates. So, if you see ventilator pneumonia, colonization of the respiratory tract and the stomach is established rapidly after the intubation, and seeding of the lung by micro aspiration occurs like this. That is first 36 hours, that is mouth and pharynx. So, whatever germs are there, they are likely to get and cause VAP. And after 36 hours, it is the germ, means the micro aspiration basically from the stomach. Then 60 to 84 hours, it is the lower respiratory tract, and then the colonized germs on the tube may cause VAP. And it is the first 5 days post intubation has got a highest rate of developing VAP, and after 5 days it is sort of a plateau phase, and later on if the patient is on ventilator say for more than 10 days, the chances of developing VAP go down further. So, when it comes to preventive the VAP, as per the SHIA guidelines in 2014, there are some basic practices, there are some special approaches, and there are some generally not recommended and no recommendation kind of aspects are there. So, what are the basic practices to prevent the VAP? Avoid intubation if possible by using non-invasive ventilation, and minimize the sedation, and maintain and improve the physical conditioning, that is provide early exercise and mobilization of these patients. So, these are basic practices, and they have to be followed. So, minimize pooling of the secretions above the endotracheal tube cuff. If you see here in this diagram, utilize endotracheal tubes with subglottic secretion drainage ports for patients expected to require greater than 2 or 3 days of mechanical ventilation. So, basically you have that cuff. When it is inflated, basically if there are any micro aspiration, the secretions are going to get pooled just above that above the inflated bag. But once you deflate it, because you might be deflating it in daily practices basically to reduce the chance of tracheomalacia. So, during that time actually those secretions get into the lower respiratory tract. and that is why there are these new endotracheal tubes with that extra drainage system, which just you can drain out whatever secretion has been pooled just above those balloons. Minimize pooling of secretion above the endotracheal tube cuff, elevate the head of the bed to 30 to 45 degree is very important. So, among these four, which is the which do you think is the right picture? So, it is the C basically. So, all of them look like that patient has got a head end of bed elevated, but this is the right one. So, maintain the ventilator circuits, change the ventilator circuits only if visibly soiled or malfunctioning, otherwise need not to change every 3 days or 4 days like earlier people used to feel. And their intervention which of special approaches to reduce the VAP. So, decontamination of the digestive tract and oropharynx in the ICU. So, where hospitals have a higher rates of VAP and they are doing all the basic recommendations, they can actually go for this to reduce the further rates of VAPs. Regular oral care with chlorhexidine has got a moderate quality of evidence to reduce the VAP. Then prophylactic probiotics, then ultra thin polyurethane tube cuffs, automated control of the endotracheal tube cuff pressure, they all have lower evidence, but only moderate evidence is with prophylactic antibiotic and regular oral care for chlorhexidine, prophylactic probiotic. So, there are approaches generally not recommended. So, generally not recommended are silver coated endotracheal tubes, kinetic beds and prone positioning, and there are some approaches which are definitely not recommended are stress ulcer prophylaxis, as earlier thought that it is one of the important fact to reduce VAP, and early tracheostomy. Again, it is previously thought of very rampantly practiced as well, that patient if is expected to get a mechanical ventilation for more than 5 or 6 days, you early tracheostomize the patient to reduce the VAP rates. That is not recommended now. Monitoring residual gastric volumes and early parenteral nutrition, these are also definitely not recommended. So, surveillance of VAP, again you are going to check the rates of VAEs or VACs, and you are going to, the denominator is total number of ventilated days into 1000 again. So, VAP, when it comes to VAP prevention, I think some is not the number and soon is not the time. So, it is the right time and it has to come down to 0 level. So, I will just go to the 7 elements of VAP bundle care, that is head end of the bed elevation to 30 to 45 degrees, daily sedation vacation and daily assessment of the readiness for extubation, hand hygiene, again the most important thing, deep venous thrombosis, DVT prophylaxis is again one of the VAP care bundle, oral care with chlorhexidine solution, very important, adequate endotracheal tube cuff pressure, that is 20 to 30 millimeters of mercury, because I have seen nurses, they usually keep it 15, 10, 17, 18 and they do not keep checking it. I think every day in the morning rounds you should check the cuff pressure and that should be adequate, that is 20 to 30. Endotracheal tube with and inline suction system and subglottic suctioning, I think this is quite cost effective when it comes to VAP. So, what are the take home messages when it comes to ventilator pneumonia? Intubation and mechanical ventilation put the patient at higher risk of developing VAPs, and that is why as much as possible you should reduce the procedures like mechanical ventilation and try if the patient can be managed on non-invasive ventilation. Current VAP definitions are subjective, not specific, and limit the value of VAP surveillance as a benchmark for improving the patient care, and that is why these new definitions have been accepted by CDC and now even NABH. So, VAP possible and probable are subgroups of infection related ventilator events, and they should be recorded only for internal quality assessment, and VAP prevention guidelines should be maintained and educated by all the hospital staffs, especially those who are working in critical care areas. We will go to our last HAI, that is surgical site infection. So when it comes to a surgical site infection, the first important thing you need to know, the basic, is the types of surgical wounds. For example, I'll tell you from my own experience. Basically, when you include all the patients, even if patient has got a dirty wound or a contaminated wound, patient comes for an incision and drainage for an abscess. If you are going to apply these rules for contaminated cases, then the SSI rates are going to be very high, and your surgeons and hospital is not going to believe those kind of rates. So that is why you should know, which cases you are going to apply the rule of surgical site infection. So it should be basically for clean surgeries and some of the clean contaminated surgeries. And for that, you should know what is clean, contaminated, and dirty. So clean wound is an uninfected operative wound in which no inflammation is encountered and there is no entry into the respiratory, alimentary, genital and urine tract. Clean wounds are closed primarily, and if necessary drained and closed with a closed drainage. And clean contaminated are operative wounds in which the respiratory, alimentary, genital or urine tract are entered under controlled conditions and without unusual contamination. So when it comes to basically, for example, I'll give you, the clean wound is a patient going for a knee replacement surgery, it's a clean wound. Patient going for a prostate surgery, it's a clean wound. But if the patient is going for say catheter, ureteric stone removal, or patient is going for say PCNL, or a patient is going for appendectomy or cholecystectomy, there chances that you might or the surgeon might be entering a GI tract or a GU tract. Then again, these are all dicey situations. That is why you need to read the surgeon's notes and what exactly happened during the surgery. If they mention that it has got a GI tract has been entered or a GU tract has been entered, then these cases are kept as a contaminated ones. And contaminated cases are open, fresh, accidental wounds, operations with major breaks in the sterile technique, or gross spillage from the gastrointestinal tract, like burst appendix. If somebody is going to operate on that, it's a contaminated case. And dirty or infected cases like old traumatic wounds with retained devitalized tissue. So chronic osteomyelitis, patients with diabetic foot, incision and drainage for an abscess, these are all procedures all come under dirty infected. So once you know the definition of these surgical wounds, you should know what is superficial incisional SSI, deep incisional SSI and organ space. So, and depending on that, the inclusion criteria have been defined. So, infection occurs within 30 days after the operative procedure and involved only skin and subcutaneous tissue of the incision, and the patient has at least one of the following, that is purulent drainage, organism isolated, at least one of the following signs or symptoms like pain, tenderness, localized swelling, redness or heat, and diagnosis of superficial incisional SSI by surgeon or an attending physician. And similar are the criteria when it comes to deep incisional SSI or organ space SSI. It is just the change of anatomy, it goes deeper. So the important ones are exclusion criteria which should be excluded. A stitch abscess, like a patient goes for a surgery and there is just this pus collection at the insertion or exit points of the stitches, that should be excluded. And some of the surgeries like circumcisions and all, they are excluded from SSI. And a localized stab wound infection is not to be reported as an SSI, instead report as a skin or soft tissue infection depending on its depth. And infected burn wounds are reported as burn and they should not come under SSI. So these are the formula for calculation of the rates. So clean cases, again number of SSIs in clean cases divided by total number of clean surgeries into 100. So mind you, this is 100. In VAP we have 1000, CAUTI we have 1000, CLABSI we have 1000, and it is the percentage here. And similarly for different cases, but by and large we just collect clean cases and clean contaminant, some of the clean contaminant cases. So again it has got a huge burden, so more than 3 lakh SSIs per year, 17% of the all HSI, I think it is one of the second most common. 2 to 5% of patients undergoing inpatient surgeries can have an SSI. Mortality is 3% mortality, 2 to 11 times higher risk of death, and 75% of deaths among patients with SSI are directly attributable to SSI. So, it is a huge killer basically. Just next to, I think, central line associated blood stream infection, SSI is one of the biggest killer when it comes to HI. And morbidities, long term disabilities are seen. So, again a huge cost. So, pathogen sources, it could be the SSI. When it comes, you want to know what exactly the germ which is causing a surgical site infection. It could be a skin flora, means directly from the patient, or mucous membrane or GI tract, or it could be seeding from a distant focus of infection. So, if patient has got a concomitant urine tract infection and undergoes a surgery, and because of the secondary bacteremia of that urine tract infection, this gets seeded and causes an SSI. This is also rarely happens. And surgical personnel, the most important thing is the dirty hands of the surgeons and their team. If they have a soiled attire, breaks in aseptic techniques, inadequate hand hygiene, lot of OR trafficking, and operating room physical environment and ventilation, and tools and equipments materials brought to the operative field from your CSSD. These are all important exogenous and modifiable risk factors for development of SSI. If you see here staph aureus, coagulase negative staph, these are basically GPCs, gram positive organisms. They are commonly seen to cause SSI, but there are some of the hospitals which have reported higher number of gram negative germs causing SSI, and that is a very risky situation because your infection control practices are not adequate. Challenges in detecting an SSI, because for example, I will tell you, a patient gets operated in X hospital, get discharged on 6th or 7th day, he develops discharging wound or a pus discharge from the surgical wound, and patient sees the same doctor in some different location, and the doctor treats that, but it is not getting reported, especially in your hospital, and that is why your SSI rates might be little low, and it could be falsely low. And antimicrobial prophylaxis is again one of the important thing when you are checking for an SSI, because you need to give a antimicrobial prophylaxis 60 minutes prior to the incision of the surgical wound. If you have another surgical wound, like for example, patient has got a bilateral hernia, so on one side you are cutting it, operating it, so just 60 minutes prior to that you need to give antibiotic. Again, the antibiotic should be repeated before the second incision. And if your surgical time is more than say 3 hours, then you can actually more than 2 hours actually repeat the next shot of antibiotic. And if your patients are heftier, you have to give a adequate dose actually. And skin or site preparation should be effective. Removal of hair with razors is again one of the important modifiable risk factor, because you should not use razors but clippers for cutting the hairs. And colorectal procedures, inadequate bowel and bowel preparations and antibiotic use is one of the risk factor for colorectal procedures. And improper intraoperative temperature regulation has been also shown to increase the risk of SSI, especially when it comes to colorectal surgeries. Additional modifiable risk factors, important ones are excessive over trafficking. Your operative room should be minimal, because you see, though you have a laminar airflow, HEPA filters in your operating rooms, people there operating. See, idea of using HEPA filter and laminar airflow is to maintain that unidirectional flow of your air, which is the clean air which is coming on the operative field. And once there is more OR trafficking, so a lot of people are coming in, coming out, the doors are being opened always, so that unidirectional flow is disturbed. So once you disturb that airflow, there are eddy currents which are formed, and they are basically going to make more turbulence. And once people who are entering into the room, they have lot of bacteria carrying particles on their body, skin, squams and all. So they are going to get mixed into the clean air of your OT, and there it is one of the important risk factor for SSI, especially when it comes to implant related surgeries. This has to be taken care in a very religiously and very strict manner. So over trafficking, lesser is the better. You plan your surgeries properly, so you have all the instruments with you, and So it should be planned, and over trafficking should be less. Inadequate wound dressing protocol. So any junior doctor coming and doing some procedure without washing his hand or her hand, then again or faulty techniques can increase the risk of SSI. Improper glucose control is one of the important things. So HbA1c less than 7 has shown to reduce the chances of SSI in one of the studies done in orthopedic surgeries, implant related orthopedic surgeries. Colonization with pre-existing microorganisms. So some of patients, especially diabetic women, if they have asymptomatic bacteriuria and going for a implant related surgery, there is sometimes an indication to give antibiotic and clean it, because it has been shown to cause increased chances of an SSI. And inadequate intraoperative oxygen levels is also one of the important things. So administer antimicrobial prophylaxis in accordance with the evidence based standard guidelines, that is 1 hour prior to incision. Then remote infection, whenever possible you should treat it. Do not remove hair at the operative site unless it will interfere with the operation, and do not use razors, use clippers. Skin preparation should be adequate. Use appropriate antiseptic agents and techniques for skin prep. Maintain immediate post-operative normothermia. When it comes to colorectal surgery patients, mechanically prepare the colon, administer non-absorbable oral antimicrobial agents in divided doses on the day before the operation to reduce the SSI. And OR trafficking, keep OR doors closed during the surgery except as needed for passage of equipments, personnel or the patient. It should always be closed. Surgical wound dressing, protect primary closure incision with sterile dressing for 24 to 48 hours post-op. Control blood glucose levels. Discontinue antibiotics within 24 hours after surgery end time. This is very important. And when it comes to cardiac surgery, it is 48 hours. Then nasal screening and decolonization only when it is staph aureus, especially if the patient is going for implant surgeries. And screen preoperative blood glucose levels and maintain tight glucose control on POD1 and POD2 in patients undergoing selective elective procedures like orthoplasties and spinal fusions. When it comes to antibiotic, redose antibiotic at 3 hours interval in procedures with duration which is more than 3 hours. Adjust antimicrobial prophylaxis dose for obese patients, body mass index more than 30, double the dose. Use at least 50% fraction of inspired oxygen intraoperatively and immediately post-operatively in selected procedures. Feedback of a surgeon specific infection rates is very important post-operatively, and you should encourage your surgeons to actually report the SSI. In my hospital, we call our nurse. We have an infection control nurse who goes to the operated patients on POD 1, 2, 3, 4 daily, and when the patient get discharged, if she calls them after 7 days, 15 days and 30 days. And when it comes to a implant related surgery like TKR or THR, it is up to 90 days. They keep a record of that, and they talk to the surgeon also, and they talk to the patient. It is in fact a goodwill actually. The patient feels that somebody is really worried about my problems, and so you should educate the patient. Patient education material is nowadays handed over, and they have been asked to call back or come to the hospital if they watch any redness or a pus coming out from the wound, or there is excruciating pain, so or fever. SSI rates, patients with SSI after selected operations divided by total number of selected operations performed into 100. This is the SSI rate, that is how you are going to calculate. And this is one of the important slides, that is WHO surgical safety checklist. So all the hospitals should have, or you should be aware of these surgical checklists. And this one of the important aspect to reduce, because all of the factors have been given here, like antibiotic prophylaxis, timing, duration, when it was discontinued, the over trafficking, everything is there and it is a comprehensive chart you can use for surveillance of an SSI. So I'm happy that you are interested in this topic, because this is one of the most important topics, and believe me, this is the era of antibiotic resistance. So you might be aware that WHO has already warned, and UN General Assembly meeting, they are discussing about antimicrobial resistance, and this is a global threat. So, for these many years we have been doing skillful surgeries like transplants, cardiac surgeries, and various implant related surgeries, everything, and it was all possible because of this gold rush, that is gold dust, that is antibiotic. And but now with misuse of these antibiotics and increasing resistance, we are losing this antibiotics. And believe me, there will be an era if we do not take proper steps to prevent the antimicrobial resistance, that we have to shut down our OTs or shut down our transplant units and bone marrow transplant and kidney and liver transplant. And we might have to go back to pre-antibiotic era, because in nearer future, that is for almost next 15 to 20 years, we are not going to have any new class of antibiotic. And that is why whatever we have with us, we have to use them very judiciously and cautiously. And one of the important reasons of misuse of antibiotic is hospital acquired infections, and that is why we should know about hospital acquired infections, and we should try our best to control them, or zero tolerance for hospital acquired infections. And one most last thing, most important last thing is washing your hands, because it requires just change of your mindset. And if you just learn that you are washing your hands properly and you are asking your colleagues to do so, that is definitely going to reduce the HAI rate significantly. Thank you.